Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to another exciting Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants broadcast. This is our first of three today. We've got an epic triple header on hand for you, and we are continuing our epic November month featuring all sorts of botany stories. It's the most plant programs we've actually ever done in our history in 1 month. So if you want to check out our YouTube channel for the ones we did to start the month, we've got a few more to wrap up November. There's lots to explore and discover right there. A big welcome to all our audience today, too. Ontario, BC, Rhode Island. I'm in Newfoundland. Paul's joining us in Ontario. We got a bevy of places all across the continent. So wherever you're joining from, it is so nice to have you back. And for those of you who are joining in as students today, you're in for a real treat because we are bringing back in one of my favorite scientists we ever bring on the broadcast, someone who joined us more than almost any other scientist in our history, and that is Paul Sokoloff. So he is joining us from Ottawa in Canada today, our capital. We've got some Americas today, I need to let you know. And today at the Museum of Nature, he's going to talk about his amazing work exploring Arctic biodiversity and specifically the plants up there. Arctic plants? What is that all about? This is something that a lot of our folks, certainly when I was a boy, I didn't know about. And so it's always really cool to highlight the adventure of going up there on field expeditions and all the amazing life that we can find in Canada's north. So without further ado, I'm going to zip my lip. Paul, welcome to the broadcast. Thank you so much for joining us, and nice to see you again.
It's good to see you, Jesse. Thank you for having me.
It is such a pleasure. You are in our future botany months, of which we will have many. You will be one of our centerpiece people because you do such cool work, and literally and figuratively cool work. And it's always a pleasure to bring you back. Paul and I were talking before the broadcast. 5+ years we've been having Paul on, so you can go to our YouTube channel and see us looking like younger men back in the past, if you're so inclined. Me without the beard and mustache. I look like a little boy. It's kind of fun. Paul, I promised I'd stop talking. So if you want to bring up your screen share and dive in with your beautiful presentation, I can't wait to get underway.
Absolutely. I'm so looking forward to it. Thank you so much. This is where I do my little dance and share my screen. Here we go. Hi, everyone. All right. So as Jesse mentioned, my name is Paul Sokoloff, and I work at the Canadian Museum of Nature. We are located in the National Capital Region. We have a building right downtown Ottawa. I don't know if anybody from Ontario has ever been there, but we also have a research and collections building on the Gatineau side of the river in Quebec. And so that's actually where I'm joining you from now, is another province. Today I'm going to tell you all about plants and lichens in Inuit Nunangat. This is Arctic botany at the Canadian Museum of Nature, and Inuit Nunangat is the Inuit homeland in Canada, which includes Nunavut, the Northwest Territories, Nunatsiavut in Labrador, and Nunavik in Quebec. So we'll jump right into it. But the first thing I want to do, and I do this at most of my presentations, is while I'm the person you're chatting with today, this is the work of a lot of people. And all of these wonderful people on the screen I've had the chance to work with on various projects, be it in the Canadian Arctic, be it in deserts in Southwest Utah, or be it right here in the office that I'm talking to you from. Science is always better done with friends. That's the way I look at it. And so when I'm talking about all of the research that we're doing, it's, all of us wonderful people who are behind the scenes making it happen. So when we talk to you a little bit about the Arctic, I can't see anybody right now, so we'll have time for questions later. I like to start off by asking people what they think the Arctic is. And if you've ever had a chance to think about places like the North Pole or the South Pole, these are the polar regions of our planet. Most people, kind of know that it's cold, right? And so if I ask you to envision what the North Pole region looks like, you probably are thinking something like this. You've got this beautiful iceberg, you've got lots of snow, maybe you've got a nice zodiac full of people looking at the icebergs and admiring it. And that's true. This is a big part of the Arctic, especially in Canada. But that's not all there is to it. In Canada and around the entire polar region, there are so many different kinds of landscapes. So we've got big river valleys that are carved out over time because glaciers were sitting on top of them. We've got massive plains of rock and of grasses. We have some shrubby areas where we get lots of little willows and other types of small shrubs growing. And we also have, this is my favorite, we've got this big scoured landscape with tents on it. You can see things coming for miles. I grew up in Alberta, so this is very home-like to me. But in Canada, over 40% of our landmass, over nearly 1.5 million square kilometers, is Arctic. And you may be asking, how are we defining that? Well, you see everything that you see here in green. That's all what a botanist like myself would consider to be Arctic, because that's all above the tree line. And maybe you've heard about the tree line. Maybe in your mind's eye, you're thinking, okay, well, this is, where the trees stop and we get tundra. And maybe it's not quite like a straight line of trees. This is what I thought when I was a kid. It was like the trees went and they just stopped right away. No, it's kind of the trees gradually get smaller and smaller, but it is a massive area in Canada. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today, because this area is really important to me, but it's also really important to lots of other people and to the ecosystems of our country as a whole. Now, I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk Inuit Nunangat, and if you've never heard of this term before, that's okay. Inuit Nunangat is a Inuktitut term for the Inuit homeland in Canada. And in Canada, there are 4 Inuit regions that botanists like myself and other researchers may visit. We have Nunavut, the territory of Nunavut, which was formally recognized in 1999. We have Nunavik, which is in northern Quebec. We have Nunatsiavut in Labrador, and we have the Inuvialuit settlement region in the Northwest Territories. And these have been Inuit homeland for time immemorial. Inuit have always lived here. So whenever we are going up as researchers in the South, we're essentially working in somebody's backyard. And it's really important for us to remember that working together is really important for everyone involved. And so whenever we get to work with knowledge holders, students, and elders in the community, it's always an amazing time as a researcher. Okay, so now that we've set kind of the scene and you know where we're working, I want to tell you a little bit about my job. I'm a botanist, and so you may be wondering, well, what exactly is a botanist? Most people know what a florist is somebody who has a shop that arranges flowers. Well, we work with flowers, but we're not florists. So as you can see here, my colleague on the left is having a wonderful time arranging flowers. I typically only arrange flowers after about 3 weeks in the field, and then I put them on top of my head. And sometimes I declare myself the king of the beans, and we call this field brain, which happens after a long field expedition. What a botanist is most interested in doing is the classification of living organisms. Well, again, I can't see any of you, but I'm going to imagine that some of you go on walks, or maybe you have a garden at home, or maybe you grow some flowers on a balcony, or maybe in your neighborhood you've seen plants growing in parks. And you probably, after a while, start to see that some plants look similar but are not quite the same. And this is what botanists do. We actually like to group things together. So I'm using an example here from the bean family. Why did I pick beans? Well, I'm actually nuts about beans. I did grad school on beans, which is a really specific and obscure thing to study, but is a lot of fun for a nerd like me. But also you might know beans as well because you may eat them. Beans are really economically important. And so as scientists, we probably would look at this and call the family the Fabaceae. And if you can't pronounce that, that's okay. It's taken me a long time to get to where I pronounce Latin names. We just talk until we understand each other. That's what botanists do. And if you look at this group of plants here, you can probably see that, okay, well, they're a little similar. Maybe the plants have similar shaped petals and, they're all like clusters of tiny flowers at the end of a stem, but there are also differences as well. You can see that some of the flowers are bigger than others, some of them are different colors, some of them are slightly different shapes, and some of them are even hanging off the stem a little differently. So what a botanist might do is we might say that these all belong to one family, but they are all different within that family. And so that's kind of the first level of classification a botanist might use. We might further go down and say, okay, well, within this big family, within this big bean family, certain individuals look more like each other while still being a little different. And so, you might think about this if you have siblings. Your siblings might look a little bit, you might look a little bit like your siblings and a little bit different than your parents. This is something that happens over time. And essentially then we group them all together into a different, more closely related group that we call a genus. In this case, we call it the genus Astragalus. This is the milk vetches. And then we can even further refine that down to the level of a species. And this is where we talk about, well, what is a species? And a species is essentially a hypothesis. And you're probably learning a little bit about what hypotheses are in terms of science. But a species is a hypothesis that everything that looks like this one particular type of plant is all one species, and we call it in Latin Astragalus bedinii. Again, working on Latin pronunciation is a lifelong effort. I'm still working on it. But a botanist might say, okay, well, one of these things, everything that's Astragalus bedinii is all essentially one grouping. Why is it important to give something a Latin name? Well, if I'm talking with a colleague and we want to talk about a specific species of plants or groups of species, I could say, oh, this yellow thing with like petals like this, et cetera, et cetera. Or I can use a species name like Astragalus bedinii, which means that I'm really easily conveying the idea that I'm talking about this one specific thing to my colleague. This is really important when it gets to things like conservation. How can we conserve the number of species in an area or the biodiversity of that area without knowing exactly how many species they are? By figuring out how many species are in an area or figuring out what a species is, we can better protect nature over the long term. Now, I mentioned that we are working in Inuit Nunangat, the Inuit homeland in Canada, which means that while I might call a willow like this Salix fuscescens, it may have a name already. In Inuktitut, on the Kivalliq region near Hudson Bay, it might be Ukpik, which is the name we learned from elders in the area. If French is your first language, you might call it Sol Fauve, or in English, we sometimes call it bog willow as well. So these are different names that all refer to the same plant. And this is essentially taxonomy, which is the Latin name that we use for the science of giving things names. And for me, it really doesn't matter what name we're calling a plant. As long as we're talking about plants, you and I are going to be friends. This is my favorite thing to talk about. So we just have to keep in mind that sometimes we may talk about them slightly differently. So now we're bringing it all together. We're talking about plants and we're talking about the Canadian Arctic, which is where I work as a scientist. All of these plants are different species that grow in the Canadian Arctic. Now, I have to tell you, I've picked these pictures for a reason, because all of these plants are super small. When I'm taking pictures of Arctic plants, I use a macro lens, which helps me get nice details. But if you hold your thumb and forefinger together about an inch, that's pretty much as big as most of these plants are. And so in order to be a botanist, that we have to go and we have to get down on our hands and knees, essentially crawl around the tundra and search out all of the different plants, the different seaweeds, the different lichens, and the different mosses that grow on this tundra area. So how do we know how many species are in an area? Well, I told you already that we have Latin names, and those Latin names help us define biodiversity, define the number of species in an area. Now, if we wanted to figure out how many species were on one particular island, we could go to that island and we could collect all of the species we saw, or we could write down all the species we saw, or if we're very lucky and you're located in a town with a herbarium, you can go down to a herbarium. And I don't know if anybody's heard of what a herbarium is before, but I'm willing to bet you've all heard of a library. And essentially, a herbarium is a library of pressed and dried plant specimens. If you've ever taken a flower and put it inside a book to dry it out, or maybe you put a leaf in a book to dry it out, well, that's essentially what I do for a job. And maybe you're getting the impression I really like my job, because that's true. Here in the museum, in fact, in this very building I'm sitting at, we have a herbarium, a plant library of over 1 million specimens. What we do in order to figure out what biodiversity is we go out on expeditions, we collect plants, we press them between sheets of paper and cardboard, and once they're flattened and dried, we store them here in the collection, the herbarium, where they are kept forever. We never throw anything out. And with all of those specimens, we have a little label that you can see on this plant in the middle that has the location that this plant was collected at, the date that we collected the plant on, who collected it, and any notes about the habitat, like, were there trees, were there rocks, was it a sunny area, was it a shady area? Those are all details that we capture, and pairing those notes with a label with the plant give us a specimen that proves that particular plant was found at that place at that time. By keeping all of these plants together over 1 million sheets, anybody who's interested in the biodiversity of an area can come here to the museum and can consult all of these specimens to figure out just exactly how many sheets there are and how many plants there are and what do they look like and how do we tell them apart. This is what we do as botanists. And so I feel very lucky. I get to go and work in this library every day. But if you were ever interested in studying plant biodiversity, you're very welcome to come on down and do the same thing. So how do we get all of these plants? Well, we never throw anything out. I mentioned that already. In fact, our oldest specimens are from 1766. That's almost 300 years ago. But our newest specimens, they're from this year that we collected just a few months ago. Of course, right now it's kind of winter, so it's not a great time to collect plants. But every summer, we try to go out into the field to collect new plants. And you can see here, these are again my colleagues. This is the team that we go up with to a different part of Arctic Canada every year to collect plant specimens and bring them back so that we can study them and we can also grow that collection of Arctic plants to have so that anybody else can study them as they may need to. So what does a typical expedition look like for us? Well, the very first thing we do is we start here at the Ottawa airport. In fact, actually, I should back up a little bit. The very first thing we do is we apply for permits. And the reason we do that is because by applying for permits, we're collecting specimens legally, which is super important. But it's also a way for us to start the conversation with local communities about us visiting. So once all the paperwork is out of the way, and there's always a lot of paperwork, we can then head out on our adventure. So we'll start here at the Ottawa airport. We'll maybe take a bigger plane to get to a smaller plane like this. Sometimes we even take a helicopter, get a little further afield. And planes like this are what take us on our adventures all around Canada. I'm very fond of these kind of, I'm very fond of them. And here you can see one actually on Ellesmere Island, which is one of the northernmost islands in Canada, which is where we've done a lot of work in the past. And we'll typically set up a remote field camp like this, where we'll be at home for up to a month on the land. Instead of, wandering around the tundra on a motorcycle or an ATV, we'll actually end up doing a lot of walking. And the reason we do that is because, as I mentioned, Arctic plants are very small. So being able to look down at our feet is really important. If you ever get a chance to go hiking with a botanist or a nature nut, we don't go very far, very fast, because we're spending a lot of time looking at our feet. And in doing so, we're trying to essentially wander around from our base camps like this. And we try to find all of the different plant species that we see in that area and make at least one collection of that plant to prove that, yes, we found that plant there, and to bring it back to the herbarium here in Ottawa. Of course, sometimes our trips are a little bit more adventurous. We actually had a chance to go down the rapids of the Soper River on southern Baffin Island about, oh no, it's over 10 years ago now. Okay, well, time flies when you're having fun. But you can see us here. We're actually enjoying running the rapids. Although if you notice in this picture, we've taken the plants off and we've portaged them around the rapids. And the reason for that is because if we lose our plants, we've lost the entire reason for the expedition. So safety first, science second, always. And then we get to have fun. But what we're doing is we're going out and we're making those collections. And so typically what we'll have to do is anytime we see a plant that we're interested in, we'll dig it out. We like to try to get the roots as well, because sometimes when we're pressing plants, we need to have those roots in order to accurately identify it. But as we're doing it, you can also see that we're taking notes the whole time we're there. These notes include everything that would go onto the label eventually, including where, when, who, kind of the 5 W's, if you've ever heard that, all relating to that plant. Now, of course, we then take these plants and we dry them either in our plant presses, or my colleague here, Jennifer, works on mosses. She just puts them in paper bags and spreads those out to dry. But we also have to live in these camps as well. And so we're often, paddling around to get around because there's a lot of water up in the Arctic. And we're also living there. So we're making food, we're setting up sleeping tents. We bring a lot of good books to read while we're there. Podcasts are great. Audiobooks are also great for being on the tundra. So it's essentially a mini home. We bring everything that we need for all of that time. While we're wandering around, we also tend to bring with us a rifle or a shotgun loaded with bear bangers. And these are a way to scare off any polar bears that may be coming at us. And so This is not something I thought when I got my biology degree. I'd also have to get my firearms license. But it turns out that especially in different parts of Arctic Canada, you need to be very wary about polar bears. So while we're looking down at the ground, trying to find all the plants, we're also looking up every once in a while at the horizon to make sure that everything is okay and that no bears looking at us. So once we have gone out onto the tundra and we've picked our plants, we bring them back to our giant processing tent. We have this big dome that's our living room essentially while we're there. And we arrange them on these sheets of newsprint. And you can actually do this yourself if you have plants that you'd like to collect. You can just find a newspaper, put them in between sheets, the plants in between sheets of newspaper, put them in a book, and once they're flattened and dried, they last for hundreds of years. I mentioned our oldest plants are nearly 300 years old, but they're actually nearly 1,000-year-old pressed plant specimens that we know about from archaeological digs. And so this is a great way to preserve things for the long term. We don't use books when we're out in the field. We use a device like this. This is called a plant press. This was state-of-the-art technology about 200 years ago, which is really great because, it hasn't changed all that much. So it's really interesting to use really old technology for these new adventures that we're doing. And as you can see, in any given day, we may end up collecting a lot. This was probably 2 days of collecting near the community of Kugluktuk in Western Nunavut about 10 years ago. You can see Jesse mentioned when we looked younger. I'm the much younger person on the right. This was pretty much a lifetime ago. And by collecting all of these plants, we're then being able to say, okay, these are all of the plant species known from an area, and that by keeping the specimens, people can check our work, or we can share that knowledge through the herbarium for future generations. Just since 2010, which is when I joined the museum, these are dots of all of the places that we have been collecting. Now, I haven't been personally involved in all of these trips, but a lot of the plants in Nunavut, in the Arctic Canada and the archipelago, you can see at the top of your screen, I've been really fortunate to be on most of those trips, collecting in different areas. And as we go into the future, we're going to be doing a lot more fieldwork in this area. And the reason is, this is one of the most rapidly changing ecosystems on our planet and in Canada. In order to better predict what will happen there now and in the future, we need to have a baseline of what plant species are currently there to do future work. And so by combining all of the fieldwork that we've done here with all of the herbarium specimens that we keep here in our plant library, we can tell some powerful stories about what kind of plants grow in the Arctic and possibly what will happen to them in the future. So I've gone through this whole cycle. So hopefully by now you see that, the Arctic is not just a place of snow and ice, but it's a place full of beautiful, wonderful flowers. That is a wonderful homeland to Inuit and is some place that I feel very privileged to be able to go and visit. And what we do as botanists is we take all of these flowers and after photographing them and documenting them, we turn them into these herbarium sheets. We turn them into these pressed plant specimens that tell us a story. By keeping these specimens, we can always prove that a particular species was growing at that place and at that time. And we always have something to refer back to when we're talking about the biodiversity of the Canadian Arctic. And of course, it's really important to keep in mind that while botanists like myself are out on the tundra looking at plants, we're always often being watched as well. So be that an Arctic fox, an Arctic hare, or one memorable time, an Arctic wolf like this, we have to be mindful that we're also someplace where we are being observed as well. And if somebody wants, I can tell the story about the Arctic wolf a little bit later. But for right now, I wanted to say a massive thank you for your attention. Kwayanami, that's the Inuit for thank you in Eastern Arctic region. Merci. And I hope I've left lots of time for questions because I'd love to chat with all of you about what you want to know more about the Arctic and botany and all of that in general. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was fantastic as always. And if you want to come out of screen share so you can see us have that conversation, awesome. I'm going to start before we dive in. I'll let our kids put on their thinking caps. What's the story of the Arctic wolf? Tell us.
Ah, okay.
Come on.
No, I definitely planted that one. So this was 2017. I was up on Ellesmere Island, about as far north as you can go in Canada with my colleague Troy. We were doing a lichen and plant survey of the area. This is in a national park too, and this is Kitinerpak National Park. And after our very first night, we arrive. It's dark. It's not dark, actually, I should say, because of the midnight sun in the Arctic in the summer. The sun never sets, especially the further you go north. It just kind of circles around. And the reason is because our planet has tilted towards the sun in the summer months. And so we set up our tents. We're really tired. We go to bed. At about 1 a.m, I get the sense that something is watching me. When you can't sleep and you jolt awake. So I wake up, and because it's warm, I had opened my tent flap a little bit, and there is a white face right in front of me, and I am just like, what? So I book it to the back of my tent, which is not very big, by the way, and I'm like terrified. Is this a polar bear? Is this what is happening here? What's going on? And it's an Arctic wolf. And I was like, oh, okay. So what's the first thing I do? I grab my phone and I take a picture because I realize I'm probably not about to die. Maybe this wasn't the wisest thing to do, to take a picture. When I got home, my husband was like, why would you take a picture? But we did try to scare the wolf away because, we're trying to sleep. So I'm making noise. I'm waking up everybody else in camp. And the way the story ends is we do successfully scare the wolf away with 5 biologists all in their pajamas on the tundra yelling at a wolf to go.
Fantastic. That's not a story that most people get in their lives. And I appreciate that you did take the photo because it's a great photo. So you know what? Tell the naysayers they're wrong.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
That's a great story to kick us off. Miss Almeida's class joining us at VPCI in Toronto. They want to know, have you found any harmful plants? And you can interpret this however you want, whether it's poisonous, whether it's invasive, anything you want to share about sort of unfortunate plants to discover on the tundra.
That's a really great question. There are some plants that are poisonous. Actually, I mentioned the beans at the very beginning. The ones that I work on, the astragalus, they're actually toxic. Not a lot of things on the tundra eat them because they're pretty small. They don't have a lot of forage value for the herbivores that live on the tundra. But in the southwestern states, they're actually incredibly toxic to cattle that are grazing there. So I always think that's interesting when I'm comparing different places that I've had the chance to work in. But we have found introduced and invasive species in the low Arctic. That trip that we were whitewater rafting on, we actually found a grass species growing in Kimmerit called foxtail barley. And this is a grass that you can see growing along roadsides here in Quebec and Ontario, but is also not necessarily known from the Canadian Arctic. So we think it was introduced maybe as seed accidentally. And so that's something that we try to keep an eye on when we're up there, introduced and invasive plants. Over time, too, what we're finding, and especially in chatting with elders who have grown up on the land, plants are changing there. A lot of shrubs are bigger than they have been before. They're maybe not necessarily new, but they're thicker than they have been before. And this can change things in ways that may be disadvantageous for other organisms that are living there. So it's really helpful for us to build this baseline so that we know in the future.
I'm really glad you mentioned this because we hear this in our animal programs a lot. You have predators coming north, orcas going up to the Arctic and hunting things that they typically didn't. Is like a huge issue for Arctic biodiversity, and so we haven't had this botanical perspective. But it's fascinating, and I always like to highlight for students. We have the chance to bring on Paul, who's had firsthand experience going up to the Arctic, bringing back this knowledge for decades now. But ask your parents, ask your teachers. I guarantee you, whatever age they are, the climate was different when they were younger. Climate change is one of those issues now that isn't scientists tell us in 30 years it's going to be like this. It's like we've all lived this. Toronto weather when I was a boy is radically different than it is now. And it leads us to our next question. Actually, I'm going to stop talking about it because our question's on the impacts of global warming or other human impacts. So you talked about some plants getting bigger, changing their habitat distribution. Is there anything else that in your experience up there you've seen from climate change over the last decade more?
Actually, this is a great story. I mean, it's really sad, but it really highlights the impacts of climate change. So about 2 years ago, I was invited to join the government of Northwest Territories surveying a rare plant that grows only in the entire planet, only grows on one peninsula in the Northwest Territories, right against the coast of the Arctic Ocean. And this particular peninsula is eroding into the ocean because the permafrost in it is thawing, which is causing waves to slowly erode it in. And I say slowly, but it's eroding at up to a pace of 5 meters a year. So you can imagine just if a river in your community, if you lost 5 meters of shoreline every year, it would not take very long to lose a lot of landmass there. And a lot of these rare plants are literally falling into the sea because this peninsula is eroding rapidly. The neighboring community of Tuktoyaktuk, which is right against the ocean, is actually considered possibly relocating the community because of the effects of global warming and climate change onto the landscape there. There is a bright side to the story, though, which is during this survey, we actually found many more populations of this particular plant, so it's probably not endangered. But if we don't find ways to mitigate climate change, if we don't find ways to take action, there are going to be all sorts of different effects on biodiversity and to human communities due to climate change. So that's a story I think that really brings it home for me.
Well, it really does. And I mean, this is something where Canada, we're lucky to have this Arctic perspective where we have so many communities up there and we get to see these things firsthand. And I think, we've heard in classes before, it's like, oh, it's a smaller community and they have to move, which is already tragic. This is something that's happening all over the world. We've got islands that are going to be completely inundated in the South Indian Ocean, that like the island is going to be gone. And people have been having cabinet meetings underwater in scuba suits to draw attention to this. Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, with like 11 million people, is moving. Like they're going to move the entire capital because it's being inundated by water. So sea level rise is this thing that, I grew up in Ontario and it's like, okay, it's far away, it's thousands of kilometers away. For the billions of people that live on coastlines on this planet, this is a real and pressing issue, especially if you're at low sea level or close to sea level, because it means you need to uproot your community, which has been there, as you said, from time immemorial. So like thousands of years of history, not gone, but like radically altered forever because of this. And this is why Arctic stories in particular are so important for our students, certainly in Canada, to learn about all the time. And that's why we feature them at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, not at all. And in fact, you mentioned it there. Almost most Inuit communities in Canada are located on the coast. So this is that pressing issue right now. I actually, I don't know if I've ever mentioned this, but I actually used to live in Jakarta. So like a long time ago when I was a kid. So I feel that too. And yeah, it's these effects, even if you don't live by the coast, exactly as you said, they'll be felt everywhere. And so climate change right now is the issue that is facing our communities, and us as biodiversity scientists are so interested in addressing.
Yeah, great question, guys. Thank you so much for that. We had one on dangers on the ice. You highlighted a few of the wildlife dangers. You've got your shotgun and wolf poking its head in the door. That's obviously something that could, in theory, present a risk. If you injure yourselves out on the ice, if one of you trips and breaks a leg, how do you get out? What's the deal? Tell us what the expedition logistics are like.
Oh, actually, logistics are my favorite. That's actually one of my favorite parts of the job, which is weird. Like if you like organizing things, if you're the kind of person who's like, oh, I love packing a bag, you're actually probably going to be a really great scientist, because it turns out that like a good 30% of our work is, have you packed everything that you need for this trip? But in doing that, we also make sure that we bring lots of first aid supplies. And so we have, I think, 6 different types of first aid kits with us, like little ones for hiking, but also big ones for base camp. And those are not just your standard first aid kits, because all of us who do this also receive wilderness first aid training. And so we're the nice thing about the museum is that they keep us safe by providing us with advanced first aid knowledge so that we can help each other if we need it in the field. Knock wood that we don't need to use that anytime soon. We also work with partners that have emergency plans that help us out. So when we're in different parts of Nunavut, we're often there with the help of an organization called the Polar Continental Shelf Project. And they help us arrange all of our different planes that go across Inuit Nunangat. They also make sure to check in with us once a day so that they know that we're safe, and they know if we need an emergency evacuation, they're in the position to do so. And so anytime we're up in the field, we're in regular contact with various people who are making sure we're okay and are ready to spring into action if we need anything. But we also bring lots of different things for our physical health, so lots of different types of medication, but also for our mental health. We're up there away from our families for up to a month, so we bring things like games, we bring things like good books, we bring things like, I always have a secret candy stash of everyone's favorite candy to break out halfway through, because we need to be able to keep going. And so essentially keeping each other safe is a multi-tiered thing. It's keeping each other mentally safe, physically safe, and then within the whole system, making sure that we have the tools that we need to stay well while we're in the field.
It's amazing to me how much the parallel is between Arctic, Antarctic, deep sea, like research vessel, and space expeditions. Like, it's the exact same process. It's the logistics, it's the planning, it's the making sure you're safe, it's the having many backups and redundancies to make sure that no matter what may befall you, there are people there that can help you in as best a way as possible. And so, worth noting for all our students, like, this sort of trope of like, oh, I'm a cool explorer and I'm going up to do this by myself, and come what may, fight out the polar bear with my bare hands, simply doesn't happen anymore. Like, even people that like ski across Antarctica solo have planned for that for like 2 years with like 500 people involved, because it's so important to keep people safe. And because of that, we've been able to make so many more discoveries than we ever did in the sort of age of swashbuckling exploration, as cool as that may be, I've got to say.
Absolutely.
Also mentioned the candy. Snickers is the most universally mentioned thing on Arctic and Antarctic expeditions of all time. Like, everybody, Snickers should cut an ad with explorers. Honestly, like, everybody has them. So that's your plug of the day, kids. Keep that in mind. We had a great question, which we don't get very often. And you know what? It can serve as our final question, because time flies when you're having fun. Do many, you know what? Give us there's two questions. We're going to do two final questions, Paul.
Perfect.
And I want to be a rebel. Do many of the plants have medicinal value, maybe for Aboriginal or Indigenous culture? I love this question.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And in fact, when we're up there, that's often a way that we can connect with communities, is because communities who have lived there forever have a deep knowledge of what plant biodiversity is. I mentioned that we sometimes work with elders about plant names, but elders also hold deep knowledge about the different properties of plants, what they can be used for, and how they can help you when you're out on the land yourself. And elders are making sure to pass that down to different generations. And in fact, one of my favorite parts of the job is we are partnered here at the museum with Nunavut Parks, and we help to collect that information to pass to communities so that it's preserved there for the park, but also for the communities. And so, yes, there are plants that can help you, because one of my favorite plants, mountain sorrel, is full of vitamin C. In fact, I sometimes have to stop eating it because I have to keep some for the collection itself. And it's great, actually. We just, like, every time I'm in Iqaluit, I'll go on a walk and I'll get some, and it's wonderful. But there are lots of other plants that have medicinal values, but also are good as technology as well. Things that can help you get a good night's sleep, or clean out the barrel of your rifle. So yes, absolutely. There are lots of plants that have great uses. And that's a great question, because, again, talking about plants.
Yep. It's something that you hear not just in Arctic expeditions and Canadian biodiversity, but a lot of our rainforest researchers are really big on this. I've been to Ecuador, and like, people got a rash, and someone with us was like, oh yeah, just grab this leaf, and then they rubbed it in the rash, and the rash is gone, right? Like, I mean, this is... Yep. Thousands of years of indigenous knowledge, and that plant probably isn't even known to science, and like, it's not something that like you can get in a pharmacy or in a bottle, but it's something that people know has a positive impact. I really encourage our classes. Braiding sweetgrass is a really famous book in Canada now. Robin Waldkemmer did an amazing job blending sort of indigenous and sort of Western science into a beautiful volume. So if you're students, I know we got a lot of grade 9s today. Check that out. It's accessible to you. It's a really, really great read. Paul, we're nearing the end of the broadcast. That's my saddest part. But we had a query about if it's just you and a bunch of other botanists all getting field brain together, or do you have geologists and geographers and biologists and other people? What's the deal? What's your team like on the ice?
Right. So typically we will have our core team of botanists or lichenologists or museum professionals working together. But we do sometimes partner with other groups too. In fact, the very first time I went up to the Arctic was into Northwest Territories with a group that was doing work on geology. They were called Geomineral Exploration, I believe. And the reason we do this is because it's so much easier to coordinate flying places if you have a whole bunch of people who are going to the same place. This is how airports work, right? So it works really well for us too. So we do often go up with colleagues, and sometimes we'll go up with archaeologists who are interested in working with communities on local areas. And often when we're flying through, I mentioned the Polar Continental Shelf Project, when we're flying through their facility, we're just meeting all sorts of different scientists who are doing things like even figuring out how is the Canadian Arctic like the moon and like Mars. There are some really cool people doing research up there. And of course, here at the museum, we have all sorts of different biologists and different geologists and different paleontologists. The more the merrier, even if I spend a lot of my time thinking about plants.
Plants are pretty cool. And those other scientists can have their day another day. So, but I like this question very much. And this is again true of space and research expeditions in the ocean and everything else. Like, it's such a team. If you want to be a botanist, fantastic. And Paul will give you some great insight on how to do that, what that day-by-day work is like. But maybe you want to be a business person or a photographer or a geochemist. And I mean, there's all those roles up there, or a pilot flying people out to Ellesmere Island. Like, I mean, there are a bazillion jobs to get to be involved in expeditions and amazing cutting edge research like this, no matter what your interests are. So I love these questions. You guys are an amazing audience. Thank you so much for all of this. And Paul, before we wrap up and say a thank you and farewell, and you can stick around with me after we're done live, is there any last message you want to leave our kids with today about your work or the museum?
That's actually, you brought up a really good point. There are so many different ways to get to do it. Here I work at the museum in a biology role, but there are also so many people who do things like process collections, who work on how do we actually get from A to B, and in particular, make the whole thing happen. I mentioned at the very beginning, science is better done with friends. And I feel really fortunate at the museum that we get to work with 400 of my closest science friends. But if you're interested in this, pursue it, right? The challenges of the future are here, and they can be addressed if you follow your passions, no matter what they are. And so I would say that's the surefire way to make things better, is to just go for it.
No better message than that. We'll have to have your other 400 friends on the broadcast in the future, and we can't hardly wait. For now, thank you so much, Paul, for our huge audience. Really appreciate you all joining us, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Bye for now, everyone. See you.